a lot of field work that we have experience in, and we just thought it would be a good idea to share some of our knowledge, some of our experiences that we've come across during our professional careers, as safety really affects everybody, and we are all responsible for safety, both professionally and personally, in our day-to-day activities. So just a quick outline of where we plan to go today with our presentation. We'll do some introductions so you guys can meet Lindsay and myself. We'll talk about our safety culture here at Civil and Environmental Consultants. We'll mention some limitations of our presentation, and then we'll move into talking about our safety practices. We've basically split this presentation up into talking about safety while working on active construction sites, which is really from the inspector perspective versus a contractor or the operator or an installer. And then we'll turn over into talking about safety practices during in-stream work. I'll start off with talking about the introductions and going into the active construction site portion of the presentation. We'll have a small break for questions, and then Lindsay will take over and discuss the in-stream work and wrap us up at the end of the hour. There'll be time for questions and feedback. I don't anticipate taking the full hour to the full extent. So there's definitely time for discussion and feedback, and Lindsay and I would really look for any comments from you guys out there. I know there's a vast array of experience on the call today, and I'm definitely not saying that Lindsay and I are the expert in this area. We just wanted to kind of share some of our experiences. So this is me, for those of you that don't know me. I've been with CEC for 14 years. I graduated from Virginia Tech 14 years ago with a degree in biological systems engineering. I'm a water resources engineer here at CEC. I love what I do. I love where I work. I'm very fortunate to have gone into the career that I went into and been able to spend so much time outside and in the field. I really do enjoy it, and I'm really fortunate to have chosen this career and found CEC. So definitely very appreciative of where my life has taken me in that aspect. My professional focus is on permit compliance, erosion prevention, sediment control inspections, stormwater sampling, and even product research and development. I've worked with construction best management practices and post-construction best management practices from an R&D standpoint. In case any of you have noticed that beautiful picture of the water in the background, I was actually able to travel to the Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, for a work trip also, which I think is probably a once in a lifetime opportunity, but I was definitely glad to be there, enjoying the heat and the water. So I'm gonna let Lindsay introduce herself next, so you guys can meet her as well.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Wilson-Kokis, and I'm originally from Georgia, but I did go to UTC for my undergraduate degree in biology, graduated in 2006. Between that time and the time that I went to grad school at WVU, I did an internship at the Tennessee Aquarium and then worked as a vet tech, then got married, moved to West Virginia, and then decided to go to West Virginia University and got my master's in soil science in 2013. So since graduating in 2013, I've mostly worked with CEC for a little over 6 years now. I did work for a consulting company for a little bit before CEC, but so I started in CEC's West Virginia office, and then in 2016, I believe, sometime in the summer, transferred to the Nashville office, which I absolutely love. So that's worked out very well for me. So I'm an environmental scientist in the water resources group with CEC. And so my primary focus is kind of the same, similar to Jeanette's, permit compliance, erosion sediment control inspections, and then MS4 compliance and support. So doing visual stream assessments, E. coli sampling, kind of getting to help out with the benthic sampling a little bit, and then as well as doing input and outfall mapping as well. So I love CEC. I love my job. I love being outside. You see some pretty cool stuff. I'm going to have some awesome photos for you guys. Some of them I took personally, some of our eco guys took, but I think that you're going to really enjoy some of the photos that both Jeanette and I have, and they're great examples of the work that we do. So.
All right, so we wanted to touch on a little bit of where we're coming from, our backgrounds, as far as our focus towards safety. And the best way that we can really describe that is to just talk about CEC's safety culture and what we work to on a day-to-day basis. So CEC's goal is to perform work in a safe manner. It's an essential component of quality. We're committed to conducting all of our work with the protection of our employees and considering health and safety of all of our employees. We want to make sure that we safeguard against any workplace hazards. We use proactive measures in order to identify those hazards and then mitigate for those hazards that we may be subject to while we're doing our job performance. We consider it a part of our everyday business. It's something that we personally should be aware of, again, both professionally and personally, not just while we're doing our jobs, but also while we're at home, driving, wherever it may be. We feel that everyone is responsible and held accountable for safety in every aspect of their job that they do. So for how CEC approaches safety, we have an established safety program, as I'm sure many of you also have that both in your respective careers, and we refer to it either from the approach, we develop project hazard assessments, otherwise referred to as PHAs, or sometimes referred to as project safety plans, PSPs. You know how consultants love to use acronyms, and so we are all over the acronyms when it comes to safety as well. So our project hazard assessments include a specific hazard identification, evaluation, and control for each task associated with the project. It identifies personal protective equipment that are required. It identifies emergency information, both site-specific and/or emergency services. It identifies any special environmental health or safety concerns that the employees need to be aware of while they're approaching the task. And then any special training, whether it's site-specific orientation or OSHA training that may be necessary in order to prepare for the task and be ready for on-site work. So potential hazards that we may look to identify could include walking long distances, weather extremes, wildlife, working in or around water. And then each one of those hazards goes through a process of, well, what is the hazard? How do we approach it? How can we mitigate for it? Is there a way to eliminate it? Is there means to install physical guards to protect our personnel from those identified hazards? And then finally, jumping into what type of personal protective equipment that we need in order to address each hazard as identified for the proposed work. And some of this may sound very familiar for those of you that have gone through HAZWOPER training. They talk about control measures, and control measures are delineated into these three different categories: engineering controls, administrative controls, and then personal protective equipment. So engineering controls are described as strategies that are designed to protect personnel by removing the hazardous condition or placing a barrier between the hazard and the personnel. So something very simple as an engineering control could be a fence. The administrative controls place limits on the exposure to that hazard rather than eliminating by placing controls over how the personnel interact with the hazard. So this is done by, from a CEC perspective, this is done by developing a safety plan. It may say, thou shalt not go here, thou may not do work in thunderous or lightning conditions, some type of administrative control that limits how the personnel operates when performing that task. And then lastly, we have personal protective equipment, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. That goes from your vest, your hard hat, your shoes, your glasses, your gloves, waders, whatever it may be, in order to do the work. And I really like the diagram shown on the right side of the screen that basically gives a hierarchy of most effective to least effective controls. And as you can see, the most effective way to eliminate our control or to address these controls is by doing engineering controls, placing some type of barricade between the personnel and the physical hazard itself. And then we continue to go down to the least effective. You could then get into administrative controls and then your PPE. So just to mention it, we know PPE is considered the least effective control, but it's probably the thing that we think of first when we think of safety. And I think that's just because it's the thing that we feel like we have control over. If when you're getting ready to go out the field, you're like, okay, I'm gonna get my glasses, let me get my hard hat, my vest. Okay, I feel like I'm ready, I'm prepared personally for what I need to do my task. So I think even though it's considered the least effective control, it's the one that all of us are personally responsible for handling and have controls over ourselves. So the PPE really can address protection to your head, protection to your eyes and face, respiratory protection, hands and skin, and then hearing. So kind of go through that checklist of man, what am I going to be exposed to when I head out in the field, when I'm going out to do this work? Think of those PPEs that you may need in place in order to do your work effectively and safely. Make sure you have the right equipment for the task that you're performing. You know, if you're heading out into in-stream work, obviously you maybe don't need steel-toe boots on. You may need waders or muck boots or whatever it may be, and just be kind of familiar and aware of the hazards that you may be approached with when you're out in the field. And that's why CEC really recommends that you do this on the front end before you get out there, before you even start work on the job, is to really make you think through everything that you're going to need before you head out in the field. Our safety plans are dynamic. So if you get out there and you see a change in the scope or a change in the project work, come back, update, reevaluate the hazards that you're subject to, and update your safety plan. And that's, you know, from a CEC perspective and beyond, we feel like this is applicable to everyone across the board. We also recommend that you be familiar with the location of a first aid kit. Ideally having one of those in your vehicle or on you. That's obviously for us, it's the closest location that we could keep first aid kit would be in the vehicle for us. That may be, you know, a site trailer or mailbox or something else on site where they may have a first aid kit available to you that if you do need access to something like that, you know where it is. You're not scrambling at the last minute trying to be like, oh man, I'm gushing blood. What do I do? It's always good to know that in advance or have one available to you and stocked and available with all the materials that you need. So I would definitely encourage you to check those, you know, each time you enter your vehicle, each time you go out in the field, making sure that you've at least cross-checked your first aid kit to see if all the materials that are needed are present and that it's also available to you. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be talking about safety practices on active construction sites and then safety practices during in-stream work. And this is where I feel like Lindsay and I really enjoy what we do. I'm really lucky to do what we do, and we're excited to share some of that experience with you guys. And again, appreciate you guys spending some time with us here in the next 45 minutes or so. So I just wanted to kind of present some limitations on this presentation. Lindsay and I are not in any way safety experts. We do not have degrees in safety at all. So this is not an all-inclusive presentation on safety. It's a brief overview of those two specific topics that we mentioned. It's based on our professional experiences and our personal lessons learned. And it's really just meant to be a friendly reminder that everyone is responsible for safety. I know it's, and this is true for me too, it's easy to kind of put it at your back of your mind. You get kind of distracted with, okay, I've got to do this. I'm looking at this, you know, and kind of getting a little bit complacent in terms of safety. And this for me was something I just really wanted to bring it back to the forefront of our conversation, both in how we approach our jobs day to day. And so it's as much as a reminder for me as I hope that it is for everybody else on the call as well. So let's go into talking about hazards on an active construction site. And as I mentioned, for CEC, each time we approach a new project, we develop a project safety plan and we identify the hazards that we may be subject to while we're doing the tasks for that project. So again, the project safety plan should be updated as needed. If there's a change in site activities, a change in the project scope, or even a change in our personnel responsibilities, any one of those 3 items or others could warrant a change in the project safety plan, or at least should warrant a reevaluation or refamiliarization with the project safety plan itself. From a CEC standpoint, we're required to have the project safety plan with us while we're out in the field. As I mentioned, it's got the emergency services numbers. It's got any site-specific emergency contact numbers on there. We're also required to identify the nearest hospital in advance so that in the event of emergency, we're not scrambling to figure out where we're supposed to go. We know where the nearest hospital location is. We know where the nearest police department is. We know where the nearest fire department is when we're going out to that site before we even get there. So it takes a little of the thought out of it once you're in the field. Hopefully it becomes a more efficient process if in the event that you ever have to do contact emergency services. We're trying to take away from a little bit of that scrambling in the field, hopefully to be more efficient with the response if that ever were to happen. So talking about identification of hazards. And again, I just want to remind everybody that I'm talking about this from an inspector perspective. So my opinion of the hazards that are most applicable to me, and I'm sure many of you guys on the call as well, is just a general site orientation, working alone, moving equipment. This is to dealing with, active construction equipment, haul roads, crane safety, traffic. A lot of times we're working on projects that are in the middle of an active roadway where we have to be aware of traffic and other drivers and the potential distractions that may come along with that as well. Walking uneven terrain, open excavations, and then falling objects. So I'm going to go through each one of these items and talk about how you can just reminders of what to do, how to mitigate for some of these, and just a caution when you're approaching these hazards. I'm sure there are many others that we could have listed. If there's any others that would be worth talking about at the break, please bring those up. I'd be happy to hear other pertinent hazards that you guys have come across on a day-to-day basis when you're working out in the field. So the first one for site orientation, I encourage you just to check in with whoever you can on site, someone who has knowledge of the daily operations at the construction site, whether it's the foreman, the site superintendent, the developer. Someone should know that you're at the site. Now, I know that if you're trying to do a surprise inspection or an audit inspection, that may take away from it a little bit, but I still highly encourage you to do it. Just from a safety perspective, they should know that you're there. And one of the benefits of checking in is it gives you the opportunity to ask about the daily operations for that time that you're there. So I'd encourage you to ask about any blasting operations that are scheduled for that day. If there are blasting operations, make sure you're aware of where those are going to be located and when they're supposed to be detonated so that you can avoid the area completely. Any areas where open excavation may be going on, or any unusual or unique activities that are planned for that day. So say, for example, I recently pulled up on a site and they were preparing to unload a bunch of pipe that day, or even beams even, but recently it was pipe. And they were like, hey, don't park there. We're expecting this, really large truck to deliver a bunch of pipe, and that's where they're gonna pull off, and you're gonna be right in the way if you stay there. So just kind of knowing and having those initial communications when you get to the site, I think can be very beneficial, just to kind of get some orientation as to what's happening out there that day. Where should you be? Where shouldn't you be? Oh, they're actively working over here. Okay, I really probably need to go and look at that, but I need to know kind of what they're doing, how they're doing it, so that I can approach the area safely. It helps you to identify any areas that you should avoid, maybe due to potentially unsafe conditions, like I mentioned, the blasting. It helps you understand the site procedures in the event of emergency. At that time, you should obtain any contact information that you need. Say if there were an emergency, you really need to contact the on-site representative as well. If not, just emergency services, because they may be the best way to direct emergency services to whatever location that you're inspecting at that time. Again, be familiar with the nearest first aid kit, and if there's an AED on site, those two things are also really good to have those initial conversations once you get to the site before you head out into the construction site. So let's talk about working alone. So often I'm doing inspections by myself. You may be in pairs, or you may be a group of you going out in the field, but I think a lot of us work alone, which is in itself a hazard and can propose some safety concerns. So if you're working alone, I encourage you to establish a means of communications. So we're fortunate now that we have really good cell service across most of the areas in Tennessee, particularly in Middle Tennessee. So establish if you think you're going to have cell service. If you don't think you're going to have cell service at those locations, try to establish a different means of communications. Maybe you can have a two-way radio, or maybe the on-site personnel have another way of communicating. I would encourage you to examine that and to check that before you kind of head out into the middle of nowhere to make sure you have some type of communication means. Ensure that a manager, supervisor, or coworker knows where you are and when you're expected to be on location. Ensure that you are physically able to perform the work. You know, if you feel dizzy, if you feel like you got sunstroke coming on, if you just, you know, maybe had the flu or whatever else is out there these days, you don't feel like you're physically able to do the work, don't do the work. Establish check-in time with your manager, supervisor, coworker, and a procedure if no response at that designated check-in time. This is something that I really harp on and encourage you guys to do. I'm frequently out in the field by myself. I frequently have staff go out in the field by themselves, doing various tasks. When they do that, I like to know where they are. I want to have an email of where they're anticipated to go. And I want to kind of have a time frame as to when they expect to be back in the office or when they expect to be leaving. And if I haven't heard from them, or if they're not back in the office when they say they thought they were going to be back, I'm making a phone call. I want to check in with them. I want to know where they are. Maybe they got delayed. Maybe they stopped and had something to eat. You know, that's fine. But having that established check-in time just kind of helps make sure that it's not like, oh man, it's 7 o'clock at night and they never came back. So definitely like that component. It's a really easy one to do. And it's also a nice way to just be like, hey, how did it go? Everything go okay? Okay, great. Understand the risks associated with the work that you're doing or the environment or location where you're going to be doing the work. Again, that kind of goes back to understanding the hazards, making sure you're prepared to face those hazards and any additional safety means that you may need to have in place while you're doing that work. And again, just a reminder, don't perform activities alone in high-risk areas. You know, obviously don't enter any confined spaces. We would really discourage you from doing any in-stream work by yourself. We don't want you out there working in lightning storms by yourselves. You know, if something goes wrong, it's always good to have a partner there for those activities. For confined space, it's required to have multiple people there just because they are high-risk activities. So make sure you consider that when you're heading out into the field and whether it is considered a high risk or and you need to be really going with a buddy. All right, moving equipment is obviously a big one, and I think probably the one that we're most familiar with and most cautious about when we are on an active construction site. So just a reminder, when there's active construction equipment, don't approach the equipment from the rear, approach it from the cab side. Make eye contact with the operator and make sure they see you. You know, make sure you're getting some kind of nod back, wave back, whatever it may be, so that you know that they saw you and you're there. And then typically what I see from operators is they'll actually stop what they're doing so that you can kind of go in and look at what you need to do. And then when you're done, just kind of give them a wave, thanks so much, you know, and get out of the area so that they can get back to work. If they don't see you, don't walk in there. Just make sure you kind of stand in their eye line, so that you're trying to catch their attention, and just wait until they can see you and you can get in there and do what you need to do. Other moving equipment, haul roads. So be aware of where the haul road locations are. Follow basic traffic rules while driving on haul roads, you know, drive on the right, etc. Lindsay was actually looking at this yesterday. She's like, huh, that's interesting. When you're doing mining, you're actually told to drive on the opposite side of the road. And I think it's just because of the difference in equipment. You know, the equipment for mining operations is so much larger that if you're sitting right in front of that piece of equipment, they can't see you. So you need to drive on the opposite side of the road. But in general, from construction activities, especially roadway or private development construction that I have been around the most, I see following basic traffic rules on those established haul roads. The biggest thing I think for haul roads, and the one that I've received the most feedback on when being on site, is to not park or block or stand in the active haul roads. Okay, those D8s and pans and whatever they are hauling. They are not in a position where they want to stop. So make sure you pull off, make sure you pull out of the way, make sure you're not standing in the middle of the haul road while you're trying to have a conversation about a check dam. Make sure you just kind of out of the way, far enough out of the way so that you're not gonna interrupt their flow of traffic. Always be cautious where haul roads cross the active roadway. Make sure you're following instructions provided by the flaggers. So again, I've seen some haul roads that just go straight across an active haul road or straight across an active roadway, and they're not stopping. So again, so just make sure that you are aware and paying attention to the directions as provided by the flaggers, and that even listening to the flaggers, make sure you just kind of caution yourself as well before you go straight across that haul road, because you don't want to be surprised by anything. The last one with moving equipment is crane safety. Just encourage you guys to avoid walking or driving underneath any suspended loads, and then avoid walking or standing or driving within the swing area of the rotating superstructure of that crane. If I see a crane, I'm trying to stay as far away as possible from it. I want to try to get near it just to make sure it's not leaking, but if it is moving at all, I am where I am in this picture, which is way up on a hill, far away from the crane itself, okay? And I encourage you guys to do the same. I understand in certain arenas and certain requirements, we do need to kind of get up close to that equipment and make sure that it's operating, make sure there aren't any leaks. But again, make sure you're doing that safely and try to give it its berth, give it its room, because again, those guys are focused on what they need to do to get their task done, and they're not watching all the little ants kind of around them. So again, I would encourage you to be extremely cautious when you're working around moving cranes like that. So our next topic I just want to mention is traffic. Make sure where possible, you should pull out of the traffic lane so that you're not obstructing active traffic flow. In areas where you can't do that, make sure you consider the need for signs, protective, it says protective vehicles, it's fine, but protecting the vehicle, whether it's by flashers or other types of cones, so that you can barricade off your vehicle and where you may be kind of getting in and out of the vehicle as well. Be mindful of the active roadway. We encourage you to stand or park away from the active travel lanes. Even when you're having a discussion, you know, don't stand right on the shoulder. Just be conscientious of moving far away from that traffic lane as possible, because you guys know there's distracted drivers that drive through these lanes all the time. I had a job up in Montgomery County where we had driver just veer right off the roadway and basically hit a berm and shot themselves up where they hit a power pole about halfway up the power pole, just because they weren't paying attention. They kind of gradually reared off the roadway and just kind of hit that berm, and it just took them straight off into the power pole. They were okay, and fortunately no one else was standing in that vicinity when that happened, but it does happen, and I know you guys are aware of that. And again, we encourage you to use any hazard lights, whether you've got extra lights on the vehicle or not. You know, you've at least got your hazard lights that you could turn on, and we encourage you to use those even when you're stopped or parked or whatever it may be. Really, you know, anytime you're working around active traffic lanes. Uneven terrain, this is a big one, and one I'm sure is kind of an obvious one, but still it's good to remind ourselves that we are going to be approaching areas where terrain is uneven. You know, it can play havoc on your ankles for sure, and especially if you're not kind of paying attention to that. Remember when I first started with CEC, I was walking across a riprap channel and I just totally lost my footing and landed on the riprap, which hurts really badly if you haven't done it before. So just kind of pay attention to the uneven terrain that you may be experiencing when you're out on these sites. So pay attention to where you're walking. I encourage you to keep your hands free out of your pockets, because when you fall, you want to brace yourselves. So if you're carrying things, you know, try to keep as much kind of tucked away in your vest and your pockets as much as you can, so that your hands are free in the event that you do fall on a site. So, you know, when I'm on a site, I have my vest on, I've got my camera in my pocket, I got my pens, I normally have my plans under my armpit. So I'm kind of got my hands a little bit free. I've definitely broken, I think, about 2 cameras, because I used to keep my camera in my back pocket, and I landed on my butt several times, and I broke my camera screen a couple times doing that. So I now have relocated it into my front pocket, typically here as well. But there are various instances that you could come across when you're out on a construction site. Even just example, you can see that open area drain that was just, you know, had its grate had been removed. There's no inlet protection there. So, I mean, one, it's a stormwater concern, but 2, it's also a safety concern, because it's just an open hole in the ground that you could easily just kind of step into and have a nasty fall if you weren't really paying attention to where you were going. If you see something like that, I encourage you to say something. You know, contact the site super, contact the developer, contact whoever it is that it has operational control over the site, and draw their attention to it and say, hey, I think this is a safety concern. It'd be really good if you could put some inlet protection around it, or otherwise restrict it to make people aware that there is a hazard at that location. And obviously you want to make sure you're wearing appropriate footwear for the work that you're doing, whether it's work boots, smoke boots, steel toe boots, whatever is necessary for the work that you're approaching. Open excavation is obviously kind of a big one. You should be aware of where open excavation areas are. This could include pipe trenches, undercuts, drainage structures, borings, foundations, retaining walls. Make sure you don't enter those systems unless there's a protective system in place that's to code. You know, that could be bracings, whatever it may be. Look, I'm not entering these. If I see these on site, I'm taking these pictures from where I'm standing. I don't have a reason to go in them. Unless you absolutely have a reason to go in, I would encourage you not to go in them, just because of the potential instability that could be associated with open excavation like that. Falling objects, if you're working in an area where objects can fall from above, make sure that you have at least one of the following in place. This could be as simple as just protection from falling objects. Maybe it's a netting, maybe it's your hard hat. Maybe there's some toe boards, some screens, a guardrail system, a barricaded area, or canopy structures that may be in place. So again, you know, look up, make sure that there isn't something that could be a potential concern. It could be minimal. You may think that it's minimal, but something falling from a great distance could could really hurt and cause some damage. So again, I encourage you to be aware of those situations where you may be working around areas where falling objects could be a concern or a hazard. One, try to avoid them as much as possible, but then if you can't, make sure there is some type of protection in place that can mitigate for potential falling objects. And then I just wanted to kind of touch on, we've gone through those hazards that we identified, and I've maybe kind of breezed through them a little bit, but I feel like, we know, we're all out there, we all do this. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but it's a good reminder, a good refresher of just to kind of bring it back to the forefront of our mindset when we go out in the field. So I just want to touch on some quick real life safety examples that I've come across in my career. The first one is a rock fall mitigation project that I was fortunate to be involved in back in 2015, I believe it was. And this is in Franklin County. So this was a known area of rock fall. Obviously, this slope here was kind of sliding a little bit. And so the job had been let to mitigate for some of that and do some hard armoring on that rock face itself. Well, during construction, I would walk up here on the top, and that's actually up here. I don't know if you guys can see my pointer. Let me get this. There we go. I would walk up along here to kind of see what the seeps were doing as they were seeping out of this hillside. And this is kind of what the up of it looked like. It was also a great view. It was really beautiful country to take a look at. But it had all these little holes and seeps in it like this. And we take a look at them. You're like, oh, yeah, there's a seep there. Okay, we'll walk around it, whatever. And not too long ago, or not too long after doing an inspection one time, the whole thing slid. It actually slid at night, which was very fortunate. No one was hurt. But it actually quickened things up from a construction process. But the whole thing slid, and the operators that were there the day or two before that it slid said they could kind of hear a clicking noise in the rock that they think was indicative of the fissures about to occur. And you can kind of see that piece of the construction equipment right there just to kind of get a scale of the size of this material. And again, this was kind of after that it had fallen. The road was closed permanently until this was complete. You can kind of see a rock ledge there still hanging out. That eventually fell as well. And just to kind of see the size of it, it's just massive. And I don't say this to say, look, don't go on a rock fall job. I just say this because construction projects are dynamic. They're constantly changing. There are hazards out there that may not be able to be controlled. And so just caution you to be thinking about that when you're approaching these sites and going out there on these dynamic projects. So just some quick lessons learned from the rockfall project myself. Always check in with on-site personnel, ask about the daily schedules, blastings, what have you, that we kind of mentioned that earlier. Remember that you're on an active construction site. It's a dynamic project. It's potentially an unsafe condition, so always be aware of your surroundings. Take caution when necessary. Pay attention to signs, restricted areas, and any directions you get from on-site personnel. Only access areas that you absolutely need to look at. Like, did I need to be on the top of the rock face looking down like that? Don't go into any areas that you really don't need to go into from whatever your task is required to as part of that job. And then always make sure you're wearing the appropriate PPE to do the project. And then lastly, I just kind of want to touch on emergency situations. What happens in the event of an emergency? What do you do? So make sure you follow the site established procedures for contacting emergency services. I was working on a project in Arkansas at a paper mill, and they were like, hey, if anything happens, if you need an emergency, make sure you call the guardhouse, okay? Call the guardhouse. They will contact emergency services. and they will tell them how to get to where you are. The plant was so big and so confusing that if you yourself had called emergency services, they may not have been able to find the way in, where you are, how to get to you. So make sure you're familiar with those requirements for contacting emergency services. Notify the on-site personnel, secure and restrict access to the area if you're not involved in the emergency itself, and then make sure you follow any instructions provided by the site personnel and or emergency services. So that kind of wraps it up for me from a construction site approach. Just want to remind you guys to be proactive in identifying hazards, assessing risks, and trying to eliminate or control those risks so that we can prevent injury or illness or environmental or property damage. Just be aware of your surroundings. If you see something unsafe, notify the on-site personnel of your concern. Don't enter those unsafe areas, and always wear your PPE. And I don't see any questions right now in the chat, so I'm going to let Lindsay take over, and then we'll check for questions again when she wraps up.
Thank you, Jeanette. So some of my slides are going to be, or my talking points will be very similar to Jeanette's as far as safety points. Some of those are going to be very similar between construction site safety and in-stream safety. You're going to have some of the same things. So kind of going back to that point of having a project safety plan prior to going into the field, like at CEC, when we developed that, we try to do a hazard safety assessment. So what are identifying the hazards prior to what we think are going to be the hazards, but also identifying which personnel are appropriate for that type of field work. Just because you have experience with field work doesn't mean that you're equipped or able to do any type of field work that there is. So, or maybe it's been a while since that person's done that type of field work. Like Jeanette used to do a lot of the visual stream assessments when she first started with CEC, but she hasn't done that in a while. So if she were to go out there tomorrow, you know, it'd be kind of a different thing for her. I'd want to make sure that she remembered some of the safety issues that she used to encounter. So in addition to having that plan in place, we also like to do a tailgate safety meeting before we actually start the work. And so in this tailgate safety meeting, we meet with the personnel and we go over everything. It's usually done by a field lead, and we just go over the safety hazards that we think are going to be there. Are there any new safety hazards that we anticipate? Has there been a change of personnel? Is it somebody that's a new employee or someone that's new to that particular project? This is also a good time to figure out what type of field experience do they have. Also, we like to make sure that at least one person is CPR trained and has their first aid training as well in that group. And we always go out as a pair at a minimum. So another good thing, if you'll go back, Jeanette, sorry. So yeah, we also like to make sure that, or one thing that I like to do is kind of ask my team, like, what are some of their fears that they have when it comes to doing field work? That's not, you don't want to be in the field with someone and then ask them or find out, you know, that they're terrified of cows or snakes or anything like that. That's kind of a bad time to figure out that they have this horrible fear of something like that. Kind of know in advance. So yeah, next slide. Next slide. There we go. So one of the most common in-stream safety hazards we see are going to be the slips, trips, and falls. So you've got the uneven surfaces both within the stream itself and in the terrain leading up to the stream. A lot of times sometimes we can park like on the side of the road and you're having to traverse down into the stream itself, or sometimes we have to park a ways from the stream and walk through the woods. So, I mean, you could have any number of things. You could have deep crevices within the stream surface. You have rocks, you have, you know, algae and sediment films that are on the rocks, slick leaves, things like that. Debris and debris dams. Yeah, Jeanette, if you can do the pointer for me. So in the far right picture, yeah, so we've got two debris dams right here. The first one that's in the center, not that one, there you go. That one is actually, there. You can't see it in the photo, but there's a barbed wire fence that's kind of holding back all of that debris. So you've got a lot of hidden hazards that are within debris dams. And I don't know if any of you remember Justin Bryan when he was here with CEC, but Justin was with me when I was doing this one. And so we ended up having to carefully climb over on the far right side of the debris dam and just kind of help each other across that and get across it very carefully. Also, you have swift water. I mean, some areas, you're doing a visual stream assessment and the water is maybe an inch or two deep. It's nothing that big of a deal. Other times we get into water that's maybe waist deep, and we have to remember that swift water can easily sweep you off your feet, and then you can definitely be into trouble. Also, ice creates a lot of slick surfaces. We don't have as much of it here in Middle Tennessee that we necessarily have to worry about, at least not as much as what I used to have to do in West Virginia. But well, definitely like last week, you'll see in the later photo, there we had like a 1/4 inch thick of ice in the stream surface itself. So next slide. Next slide. Okay, so some of the safe practices that we use to help prevent slips, trips, and falls, watch your footing. And so what does that mean? I mean, we say that a lot, like watch your footing. It could also mean just literally watching the steps in front of you, but also if, like I found out from personal experience a couple of years ago, I was doing some visual stream assessment and the stream bottom appeared to be fairly solid. And so I was like carefully stepping 1 foot at a time. And then suddenly it was like just this thick layer of a silty bottom. So I took a step in and then was stuck down into my knees of silt. So I actually had to have my field partner pull me out that day. But so yeah, just watch your footing, carefully step through. Don't get into a rush. Like you can easily slip and fall. The last thing you want is to have some kind of head injury or twist your ankle, break your ankle, anything like that. And then you're having to try to get out and have some kind of emergency services. You don't want to have to do that. Look for a safer way around debris and debris dams. I mean, like the previous slide that I had where I was talking about Justin Bryan and I having to climb over that debris dam to be able to get around it. We took our time, we helped each other out. And sometimes that's the best that you can do. Sometimes there's not a safer way around it. But either way, just do what you can and be courteous to your partner as well. Suggested PPE for almost every hazard that we have in stream is going to be kind of the same. Wearing the appropriate footwear, whether that's waders, waders with felt bottom shoes, muck boots, or something similar to that. Eye protection is actually a required CEC field PPE that we have. Long sleeves and probably gloves, especially if you think that you are going to be in an area where there may be barbed wire fencing or other debris that you're going to have to climb over. Gloves are really good and that'll help save your hands. Next slide. Here's some really great photos of slips, trips, and falls hazards. We've got some debris with swift water. We've got swift water with no visible debris. We've got debris like in the center one. We've got some debris with also metal sheeting kind of hidden under there. In the bottom, you can see the thick ice that we kind of ran into last week, which was interesting. And then on the far right side, there was like an old road. And so that roadway was creating a fish barrier, but the roadway itself had like a thin layer of algae. So it was really slick. Yeah, right there. And you've got the swift water. So, I mean, we had to carefully cross that because if you were to slip and fall, crack your skull open, fall into the water, you could easily drown. And then your field partner is trying to get after you. So there are a lot of hazards with that. Just take your time. And just help out your field partner where you can. And if you can, try to find a safer way around any of those barriers. Next slide. Another one kind of similar. A lot of these you'll see that are kind of build upon each other. So cuts and puncture wounds. So both in stream and as you're walking up to the stream, so near the stream, free or loose strands of barbed wire. So you can see in the bottom middle picture, you could barely even see that strand of wire as we were walking through the woods to get to the stream. You've also got intact barbed wire fences. You have sheet metal fences, rocks, in the photo in the far right. I mean, there are several trip hazards right there, but those trip hazards could easily lead to puncture wounds and cuts. So you have a fence that's down there's barbed wire on the top of it. You've got a riprap apron that's washed out in front of that. So lots of hazards right there. Luckily with that one, we were able to find a safer way around that and not have to try to climb over all of that mess. So next slide. Some of the safe practices for this, again, just be really careful with observing your surroundings, especially like any kind of loose fencing, barbed wire fencing like that. Sometimes, again, it may not be intact, so you don't see it. Just be careful when stepping over it. You know, try not to get caught up in it. I've heard horror stories from surveyors who have stepped on a piece of loose barbed wire fence and it actually came up and it like cut the guy on top of his head. And so that's not something that you want. Again, try to look for a safer way around it. Some people have suggested is this T-post climber. I haven't actually used this one in the field. It does hook onto a T-post. So this would be like if you're doing an intact barbed wire fence. The only thing is you would have to be really careful to make sure that it's properly secured onto the T-post, because if it's not, and you put your full weight on it and it slips down, you don't really want that to happen. And they get tangled up in the barbed wire. So again, PPE that's recommended: boots, gloves, eye protection, and long sleeves. Next slide. So we've got all kinds of wildlife that we encounter. Ticks, probably one of the most common ones. One of the benefits of wearing full chest waders is the ticks aren't getting up inside of your clothing. So that's a benefit. Safe practices there: insect repellent, long sleeves. Definitely do a tick check at the end of the day. And I know, like with CEC's policy, if you do find a tick bite, you know, make sure that you report it and monitor the area. So next slide. Stinging insects, another one. With this one, it's always a good idea to make sure to see if your partner has any known allergies to any bee stings or anything like that. If they do, make sure they have their EpiPen or whatever it is that they need to make sure that they're going to get the attention that they need for that. So yeah, just know if your partner is allergic. If it's a single stinging insect, remain calm. Don't swat at it or anything like that. For a swarm, and I actually didn't know this until I looked it up, it's not recommended to jump in the water for evading a swarm, because apparently some species can actually hover over the water and will wait for you to resurface and then start stinging you again. So what was recommended was just to calmly try to move out of the area or run away, but don't get in the water was what was recommended, and then apply appropriate first aid. Next slide. So we go to livestock: cows, bulls, horses, donkeys. Again, I've had field partners that were terrified of cows, so which was a little bit hilarious for me, but you know, again, everybody has their fears. Just be aware of your surroundings, observe and respect the animal's behavioral warnings. You know, if a horse or donkey has pinned ears, that's their warning to you. They're not happy. You're encroaching on their territory. So just calmly walk away, find a different way around it, or possibly contact the property owner if accessing the stream through that way is the only way that you can. So just be respectful of it. Domestic pets. So Fido and Whiskers. Don't always assume that they're going to be friendly. These two in the photos that we have here were particularly friendly. So they were nice to work with. The dog actually followed me for the entire day. So he was my field partner. Again, the same thing, just observe, respect their demeanor, contact the property owner if necessary. We also at CEC have some dog repellent spray that I like to carry with me. I'm sure in an emergency situation, if there were some crazy person, that might work on a person too. So it's a multifunctional type of spray, I guess. Next slide. This one is probably of all the wildlife, people are probably the most unpredictable type of wildlife. So again, always try to respect, like no trespassing signs, find a different way, or contact the property owner to see if you can get permission to access that section of the stream. Be polite if you're approached. Try to avoid arguing with anyone. Luckily, most people that come out while we're doing in-stream work are just curious. You tell them, explain kind of what you're doing, and they think, oh, well, that's really cool. Or they want to stand there and tell you all about their flood issues or other concerns that they have. So, which is pretty good. That's not bad at all. I've only once had a gun pulled on me, but that wasn't at CEC. That was at a company I worked for before CEC, which was quite a scary experience. But also, we like to always wear a safety vest. You could wear the yellow vest, but we prefer to do the hunter safety orange vest, especially when we're in the woods. And as we found that kind of from personal experience too, is just to, if it's during gun season, we try not to work out in the county. We prefer just to only work in the city limits. And that way it helps avoid us getting shot at by accident. Also carry business cards and or an ID badge with you. And of course, everyone's favorite wildlife, snakes. Again, watch your step with that one. Try to avoid reaching or stepping over anything that you can't see into very well, especially when it's warmer outside. I shouldn't have to say it, but don't touch the snakes. Don't poke them with a stick. Don't, see what it can do. We have a lot of people that, some people get curious about that. Like, oh, let's poke it with a stick. Like, is it going to get mad? Don't do that. You just want to avoid it. So just try to respect its space, walk around it, try to avoid being within the striking distance. There's a link at the bottom for some first aid to snake bites. Next slide. So I asked some of our eco guys if they had any snake photos for me, and they definitely came through with some good ones right here. So we've got some timber rattlesnakes, water moccasins, and then this beautiful albino rat snake on the far right. I think that's such an amazing photo. But I also, again, going back to safety and knowing what your field partner is afraid of. I had one time that was really afraid of snakes, and she asked me, she said, well, we're safe as long as we're in the water, right? Because snakes don't swim. I said, no, snakes do swim, and they are going to be in the water. So just kind of make sure that you and your field partner are on the same page as far as what hazards to look for, where they might occur, and what you can do to help avoid those hazards. Next slide. Some vegetation, of course, poison ivy, poison oak, poison sumac, all things you kind of want to watch out for. Low-hanging branches, briars, dense growth, fallen trees, pretty much anything like that. There are a lot of vegetation. That's another reason we try to do most of our stream assessments during the winter and fall months. That way we're not fighting the vegetation as much, and it makes it a little bit easier to see kind of what's going on. Next slide. Again, some of the safe practices for this, wearing long sleeves. At CEC, we also have like these little towelettes. So we've got the pre-contact skin solution, or they also make this in a cream. And then we also have the cleansing solution after you've actually come into contact with poison ivy or poison oak, and it helps wash off some of the oils. So those are good to have with you in the field, and both on you personally and in the truck too. Again, eye protection is a safety requirement at CEC. Be cognizant of your field partner behind you as you're walking in the stream and you're watching your footing, so you are looking down. Make sure you look up too, because you don't want to be walking around and then you're hitting the head with a branch or something that's low hanging, or if you're walking through some dense vegetation, again, your partner behind you, don't let the limb just whack them in the face. Don't do that. Try to be cognizant of that and be courteous to each other. Next slide. Weather extremes, we all know about this one. Heat, cold, ice, snow. It's really important to monitor the weather before you go out to the field and while you're in the field. We try to monitor it so that we don't have anything planned if there is any slight chance of a thunderstorm, because that's not something that we want to do. We don't want to be stuck out there in the stream during a thunderstorm. And, sometimes sections of streams can be fully unshaded, and during the summertime that gets hot. I mean, if you're doing VSA and it's, literally 95 degrees outside, there's no shade and you're wearing waders, you get hot pretty quickly. Hate these motion censored lights. So make sure that you stay hydrated with this and just monitor the weather. Next slide. Take breaks, especially in warmer weather. Carry water with you, maybe some snacks. Try to take breaks and cool off. During cold weather, hot hands are amazing. Carry that with you. Keeps your hands warm. We log all of our data on with iPads, so a lot of times your hands start to get a little bit cold. Take a break with that. Carry the iPad under your arm. Warm up your hands, gloves, hot hands, anything like that. Use sunscreen and wear clothing that's appropriate for the weather. If you do get stuck outside in a thunderstorm, obviously get out of the water. Don't stand under a tree. Try to find some kind of low spot in the ground. Or if you're close to your truck or a building or something like that, try to seek shelter. That's the best option. But again, just try to monitor the weather beforehand. If you can avoid going out, if there's a chance of thunderstorms, then just reschedule the field work. It's not worth trying to get stuck out there and having to worry about that. Next slide. So quick summary for this, some of the PPE that we recommend. Again, we always work as a pair and at least one person is CPR and first aid trained. Wear a safety vest, eye protection, appropriate footwear, insect or dog repellents, first aid kit. Like I always carry with me, like on my person, a smaller first aid kit that has just the basics in there. And then in the truck, I have a larger first aid kit. So we need that. Snacks, water, a dry change of clothing, hand sanitizer, and dress appropriately for the conditions, whether it's going to be warm or cold. Next slide. Kind of the same thing that Jeanette reminded us of. Always inform someone, a project manager or supervisor, of your intended location and your approximate return time. At CEC, we also like to inform our client of where we're going to be located for that day. That way they're aware of what we're going to be doing. So, but also that way, in case if they get any phone calls saying, hey, we see these people walking in the stream, what's that about? Like, why are they there? Are they supposed to be there? That way the client knows and they expect, like, yeah, okay, yeah, we know that they're supposed to be there. This is what they're doing. And they can help address some of those questions. And watch your footing, be aware of your surroundings, be polite, respectful to property owners. I kind of always like to assume that I'm being watched by someone, because I've had instances where I was walking into the woods to go do a stream assessment, didn't see a soul. As soon as I got back out to my truck, the sheriff was waiting for me. And he said that he had gotten several phone calls about some strange person walking in a stream. I never saw anyone, but other people saw me and had called the police on me. So again, just assume that that's a good idea to let the police department know that day that you're going to be out there. That also helps kind of mitigate that sometimes. This particular sheriff was very aware of TDEC and had done some, because he was a farmer himself, farmer/sheriff. So he was pretty familiar with TDEC, and so he didn't have an issue with that. But also, again, have fun. I mean, Jeanette and I both love doing field work. We love our jobs. So just have fun, but be as safe as you can out there. Next slide. And these are some of my favorites. Really pretty stream. I've got a newt, and then me just goofing off trying to stay warm while I was at work. So thank you. And Jeanette, do you have anything?
No, we really appreciate the time. I'm sorry we ran a little bit over. If you have any questions for either one of us, please feel free to reach out. Charlene, I think, will distribute our presentation that you guys can keep or have access to. And again, we just really appreciate the time and the opportunity to provide this in support of TNSA. So Charlene, we appreciate the time and thank you for letting us do this. And again, we're sorry we ran a little bit long.
No, that's okay. Thank you so much. That was a lot of good information. Especially that rock fall just really got me. Holy cow, that was a crazy
good
picture
reminder
there.
of how things can change dramatically.
Exactly. It's a lot of good reminders of a lot of different things. So I think that's great. These folks are out all the time. And maybe it's a good reminder, or maybe it's things that they didn't think about before. I really appreciate it, ladies. If you can quit sharing your screen for a second, I'm just going to share a little bit of information very quickly about what we have coming up. So sorry, this takes a second to move, for that to move out of the way. Oh, Lord. Sorry, this tab at the top, I can't. Anyway, I'm just gonna let you guys look at it this way. Here's our next upcoming TNSA talk. It is Thursday, February 18th at 1 p.m. Remember, it's Central Time. We have a new speaker and a new organization, Dayton Marchese with Opti will be speaking about journey to a smart watershed. So you can go ahead and register for that right now on the website. And remember, your information comes out the afternoon before the talk. So just remember that. And then also remember that we have the annual conference that we are still planning for in person at Montgomery Bell State Park. That will be October 19th through 21st, with hopefully we will be having a workshop on the 18th. Rooms are ready to book if you are ready to sign up. We have the committee in place. We're planning on doing the social, DJ Dude, other things that we've done in the past. We're really excited to get together with everyone. Just so you know, your PDH certificate will be emailed to you, so make sure I have your correct email address on this Zoom. And if there's any other information, Jeanette and Lindsay will send that to me, and I'll get that out as well. Let me double check. If we have any other chat questions or anything going on. Thank you, Sarah, for that information. And if we don't have any other questions, I'm going to say goodbye.